It started with a bargain no one wanted, an abandoned lodge sinking into the mud of Haven Bay. Edward Hale, 58, bought it anyway, not for money, but for a chance to start fresh. But Bruno, his loyal German shepherd, found more than rotten wood. A sick child, a desperate mother, and a trail of ghost signatures that powerful men were willing to burn a town to protect. That night, under the rain-soaked bell tower, the truth finally found its voice, and Haven Bay found its courage. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. A cold, salt wind drifted across Haven Bay, carrying the faint smell of pine resin and forgotten summers. Edward Barnes, 60 years old and still carrying himself with the tall, lean posture of a man who once believed life could be shaped by careful decisions, guided his truck down the gravel road toward the abandoned Haven Bay retreat. His salt and pepper hair, neatly combed but always unruly at the temples, framed a face marked by weathered kindness and a few old scars of disappointment, divorce, loneliness, and a silence in the evenings that no fireplace could quite warm. Despite the wealth he had earned as a high-end real estate advisor, helping wealthy families purchase properties they often never lived in, he carried a quiet ache, a longing for something less hollow than marble foyers and business cards. Beside him sat Bruno, his 6-year-old German shepherd. Bruno's black and tan coat glowed with healthy sheen, his amber eyes alert, his powerful frame shifting with an almost human awareness. He wore a dark leather collar engraved simply, Bruno, guard and friend. The dog had been Edward's companion since the days following his divorce, when the house was too quiet and the future too formless. Bruno had a habit of sensing Edward's moods and a courage that had surprised more than one coyote back in Colorado. Today, Bruno stood rigid in the passenger seat, nose pressed toward the cracked window. Something in the wind unsettled him. Edward noted it. "Easy, boy. Probably just raccoons." But the tension in Bruno's shoulders persisted. Haven Bay Retreat appeared through the mist like the bones of a forgotten dream, wooden cabins sagging under years of storms, paint peeling in long, sorrowful strips, a boardwalk leading toward a gray shoreline where gulls drifted low. Edward had bought the entire property for a fraction of its worth, imagining a place where elderly folks could retire among ocean breezes and book clubs instead of hospital rooms and loneliness. He had envisioned gardens, fireplaces, watercolor classes, companionship, a place where aging didn't feel like a slow, silent erasing. As he stepped out of the truck, the boards creaked softly. Bruno leaped down, sniffing the ground with increasing urgency. The dog froze, ears thrust forward, a single paw hovered mid-step, his signal for something alive, recent. Then Edward smelled it too. Smoke, thin, wood fire, wrong. "Someone's here," he murmured. Bruno followed the scent, and Edward quickened his pace behind him, heart thumping with a confusing blend of irritation and apprehension. Trespassers were common in abandoned sites, but this smoke felt purposeful, domestic, human. They rounded a corner near the old general store building, once painted a cheerful red, now dulled to a bruised clay, and Bruno lowered his head, muscles rippling, footprints, fresh, small ones, child-sized. The door hung open by an inch. Edward's throat tightened as he pushed it wider. Inside, the dim space smelled of dryness, dust, and something more fragile, fear. On the floor lay thin blankets stretched across wooden crates arranged like makeshift beds. A pot simmered weakly atop a rusted stove. Canned goods lined shelves that had once displayed postcards and saltwater taffy. And near the back, holding a tin cup of water, stood a woman, Ruth Gardner. Ruth was perhaps 62, a tall but stooped woman with wiry gray hair tucked into a loose bun. Her skin held the color of someone who had lived too long under hard sun, tan, creased, but somehow resolute. Her eyes, a muted green, flickered between apology and defensiveness. She wore a patched brown coat and boots 2 sizes too big, stuffed with cloth. Her hands trembled slightly, the tremble of someone who had been holding herself together far too long. Beside her lay a small girl, Sophie, no more than 12. Sophie's face was pale, almost translucent, with dark rings beneath her eyes. Her light brown hair clung damp to her forehead. When she coughed, the sound scraped through her chest like rusted hinges protesting movement. Ruth stepped forward instinctively, half shielding the child. We're sorry," she said, voice brittle. We weren't trying to cause trouble. We just, Needed a place away from the wind, just until winter passes. Edward exhaled slowly, fighting the mixture of confusion and softening pity rising in him. How long have you been here? Almost a month, Ruth whispered. The storms took our house. The bank took what was left. Sophie's been sick. Couldn't walk far. We had nowhere else. Bruno stepped toward Sophie, sniffing lightly, then looked up at Edward with a soft, urgent whine, as if recognizing illness the way he once had with Edward's ex-wife when she fainted years ago. Edward knelt beside the girl, pressing his fingers gently to her forehead. Heat. Too much. This was no simple cold. You should have gone to the clinic in Sandbrook, he said gently. Ruth shook her head, then lowered it. I tried. They charge for everything now. They said we needed proof of residency, insurance. And I lost all the papers when the roof collapsed. I didn't have the money. She clenched her jaw, hands trembling again. I won't let them take her. Not again. Not after everything. The ache inside Edward deepened. He had seen fights with banks, heartless, rigid systems that valued signatures over souls. But he could also feel the creeping sense of responsibility unfurling inside him. This property was his. These people were on his land. Their fate somehow had landed at his feet like driftwood from the storm. You can't stay here, Edward said softly. But Ruth's eyes filled instantly with terror. He raised a hand. No, I mean, it isn't safe. Not with the holes in the roof. And the cold will only get worse. Sophie coughed violently, folding into Ruth's arms. Edward steadied her small shoulder with his hand. There's a cafe in town, Harbor Light. They'll have warmth. I'll take you there. Ruth hesitated. Pride flickered across her features. Pride damaged but not broken. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, Edward replied. It's common sense. The general store door creaked open a few minutes later as Edward guided Ruth and Sophie outside. Bruno stuck close to Sophie's side, his protective instinct turning him into a silent escort. The Harbor Light Cafe and Bookshop glowed with amber warmth at the center of the small seaside town. The air inside smelled of cinnamon, old pages, and roasted beans. Behind the counter stood Clara Monroe, a 59-year-old widow with silver-streaked chestnut hair, loosely pinned back, warm hazel eyes, and a smile shaped by equal parts humor and resilience. Clara carried herself with the graceful stature of someone who had spent a lifetime listening rather than shouting. She wore a long gray cardigan dusted with flour and always kept a pencil tucked behind her ear for emergency poems, as she liked to say. When Edward led Ruth and Sophie inside, Clara paused mid-pour of a latte. Her brows lifted, but instead of alarm, she gave a soft, teasing smile. Well, she said lightly, if these are ghosts from the old retreat, at least they look like the type who'd order decaf. The line pulled a surprised laugh from Edward, a shaky exhale from Ruth, and a tiny, almost invisible smile from Sophie. Clara's humor worked like warm hands around cold ones. She stepped closer, eyeing Sophie with gentle concern. Let's get her by the fire. Edward helped settle Sophie into a plush armchair while Clara fetched blankets. Ruth whispered thanks, voice cracking under the weight of helplessness and relief. Clara touched the woman's arm. You're safe here. Whatever happened can be sorted out with time and warm tea. But Edward, standing behind them, felt the subtle shift of the wind outside. Bruno stiffened again, ears angled toward the window. Something, or someone, was approaching the retreat, and it wasn't the wind. Edward's thoughts tightened like a drawn rope as he met Bruno's alert gaze. What is it, boy? Bruno gave a low growl, barely audible, deep enough to vibrate the floorboards. Edward turned toward the glass just as a shadow passed across the bay road, tall, deliberate, purposeful. And without knowing why, Edward felt the first cold edge of danger slip beneath his skin. Something was coming for Haven Bay, something he wasn't prepared for. Morning light crept across Haven Bay like a cautious visitor, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace inside Harbor Light Cafe. Edward Barnes sat near the window, hands wrapped around a mug Clara had pressed on him, even though he'd insisted he didn't need anything. Ruth Gardner sat close to the fireplace with Sophie curled under blankets. The girl's breathing was shallow, but steadier in the warmth. Bruno lay at her feet, tail curled protectively around her legs, as if guarding a member of his pack. Edward's mind churned restlessly beneath his composed exterior. He saw flashing glimpses of the abandoned retreat, the makeshift beds, the sick girl, and the shadow that had crossed the road the night before. His instincts, sharpened not by violence but by decades of reading people, told him something larger was unfolding, something calculated, something smelling faintly of ink and greed. Clara Monroe wiped the counter with absent-minded strokes, her warm hazel eyes shifting constantly toward the window, as if she too sensed a shift in the air. Today she wore a burgundy shawl that softened the silver in her chestnut hair. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who had weathered storms of her own. Losing her husband to heart failure 15 years earlier had carved a quiet resilience into her smile. Edward rose to refill his cup just as the cafe door burst inward. Sheriff Harvey Crowder strode inside with the heavy authority of a man who believed the town's laws were written in the shape of his boots. Crowder was 58, broad-shouldered, with skin weathered like old barnwood. His graying blonde mustache framed a mouth used to giving orders rather than explanations. Deep lines cut across his forehead, not from wisdom, but from years of irritation, stubbornness, and the pressure of maintaining reputation in a small town. His uniform, tan and fitted, hung slightly tighter around his midsection, suggesting a man who still ate like he was 30, despite a metabolism that had long surrendered the war. 2 deputies trailed behind him, both lesser figures, one tall and thin, the other short and stocky, wearing expressions that said they preferred paperwork to confrontation. Crowder's eyes scanned the room and landed on Ruth. Something triumphant flared in his gaze, though he masked it behind thin professionalism. "Ruth Gardner," he declared, "you're to come with me. You owe Millfield Bank exactly $1,000 in overdue loan fees. There's a warrant for detainment until repayment." Sophie sat up, panic shaking through her weakened form. Ruth stood, too quickly, steadying herself on the table. "Sheriff, please, my girl is sick. I need a few days." "Law doesn't pause for coughs," Crowder snapped. Edward stepped forward, jaw tightening. "This property dispute doesn't fall under your jurisdiction, Sheriff. Haven Bay Retreat is my land. She wasn't trespassing, not in the legal sense that would warrant arrest." Crowder turned toward him with the slow amusement of a lion acknowledging an inconvenient rabbit. "You think buying a pile of rotting cabins makes you a judge now? I've got paperwork from Millfield Bank proving Ruth signed for a loan 3 years ago. She didn't pay, she runs. That's the profile of a debtor." "She never signed anything," Edward countered. "I saw her hands yesterday. They're steady enough to carry her granddaughter, but she couldn't forge a signature to save her life. Someone else." Crowder cut him off. "Someone else is none of my concern. My concern is the law." He gestured to the deputies. "Take her." Bruno shot up, hackles rising. He planted himself between the fireplace and the deputies, emitting a deep, resonant growl that vibrated the wooden floorboards. His torn right ear stood rigid, his amber eyes sending a warning that even a fool could interpret. The deputies froze. Crowder scoffed. "Call off your mutt." Edward's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "You're escalating a situation involving a sick child and a woman who has nowhere to go. Let's not make this uglier." Crowder's nostrils flared, but he was not stupid, just prideful. And prideful men, Edward knew, often feared losing face more than losing fights. Crowder lifted a hand. "Fine, I'll be back tomorrow, with proper force, and with the bank's attorneys, if needed. Paperwork doesn't lie." He stepped closer to Edward, lowering his voice. "I know your type, wealthy, thinking you can fix things with charm and compassion, but compassion gets people hurt. Paperwork protects towns." He tapped the badge on his chest. "Remember that." Then he strode out, deputies following like reluctant shadows. The door closed with a thud that felt heavier than the wood it carried. Ruth slumped into the chair, shoulders shaking. Clara moved to her side, placing a hand gently on her back. "You're safe here for now," Clara whispered. "We'll sort this out." Edward paced near the counter, running a hand through his hair. He felt the old anger rising, the anger of someone who had watched systems bulldoze people for decades. But something else simmered beneath it, a growing thread of protectiveness. For Ruth, for Sophie, for this fragile little cafe where warmth was a fragile currency. Clara approached quietly, her shawl brushing his arm. She held an envelope, cream-colored, sealed neatly. "Edward," she murmured, "this came last night, slipped under the cafe door. No name on it, but I think it's meant for you." His brow furrowed as he took it. "What is it?" Something that might explain why Crowder is pushing so hard. Bruno approached too, sniffing the envelope with a sharpness that made Edward's pulse jump. The dog sensed tension like others sensed perfume. Inside was a single printed sheet, a screenshot of messages. Anonymous sender. The words chilled the air around him. Signature falsified. Millfield knows. They're covering it. If anyone questions the debt, there's a risk. DC. DC? Edward murmured. Clara nodded. Daniel Cho. He was a clerk at the bank a while back. Quiet man, shy, paced a lot, looked like he was always afraid of his own shadow. He left town suddenly. No one knows where he went. Edward reread the message. A name, a confession, a cover-up. Ann Crowder returning tomorrow. His mind spun through possibilities, but each conclusion led deeper into something poisonous, and it wasn't lost on him that whoever delivered the envelope had done so secretly. Someone was scared. Sophie can't be moved, Edward muttered, and Ruth won't survive a night in a cell. We have less than a day. Clara touched his wrist gently, grounding him. Then we find the truth before Crowder brings his storm. You're not alone in this. Bruno barked once, sharp, urgent, as if adding his vote. Edward took a deep breath. First step is finding Daniel Cho. Clara nodded. I might know someone who can help. A woman who keeps old bank directories. Eleanor Tice, retired librarian, 74, sharp as a gull's beak. But before Edward could respond, Bruno stiffened again, turning toward the cafe window. His growl rolled like thunder. Outside, a black SUV slowed near the curb. The windows were tinted, too dark for any local resident. It idled for several seconds, engine grumbling like a warning. Then it rolled away. But not before Edward glimpsed a gloved hand in the passenger seat, holding something that looked disturbingly like a stack of official documents. Documents he knew had been forged, documents coming for Ruth, documents that might swallow the whole town next. Dusk clung to Haven Bay like a veil of gray silk, dimming the edges of buildings, softening footprints left on the gravel road outside Harbor Light Cafe. Edward Barnes stepped into the cold air with Bruno at heel, the envelope from Daniel Cho still folded tightly in his coat pocket. The SUV had vanished, leaving behind only tire tracks that cut across the frost like silent threats. Clara had urged him to rest, but rest felt impossible. Every instinct, every sharpened intuition honed from decades of reading people and problems, told him the danger was expanding, not fading. Ruth Gardner, after settling Sophie to sleep in the cafe's upstairs reading room, had tried to apologize for the trouble, but Edward had stopped her. You didn't create this, he'd said. Someone else did. Someone relying on silence. And silence, he added, glancing at Bruno, is something I'm not good at. Now he walked briskly with Bruno toward the old maintenance barn beside the retreat grounds. The building sagged slightly under the weight of time, but its structure remained firm. Heavy timber beams, rusted hinges, a wide loft designed for storing equipment long since forgotten. Bruno sniffed the wind, his ears pricked forward. The dog's pace quickened, paws moving with purposeful urgency. When he reached the barn door, he nudged it with his snout, glancing back at Edward as if urging him to hurry. All right, boy, Edward murmured, pushing the door open. Inside, the barn smelled of dust, old rope, sea salt drifted in from the bay, and something sharper, a faint, oily scent, ink, glue. It prickled the memories of office rooms and contract signing tables, of bankers who smoothed lies under layers of paperwork. Bruno followed the scent through fallen hay bales and old sled rails until he reached the ladder to the loft. The dog whined softly, pawing the first rung. You want me up there? Edward asked. Bruno's response was a firm tail swish and another urgent whine. Edward climbed. The loft creaked beneath his weight, releasing a soft sigh of dust. Pale moonlight filtered through a missing plank in the wall, illuminating a far corner where a tarp lay, draped over something large. Bruno hopped up beside him, surprisingly nimble for his size, and pressed his nose to the tarp. The smell hit Edward fully now. Oil-based ink, the kind used on stamps, seals, and official documents. His stomach tightened. He lifted the tarp slowly. A wooden chest rested beneath it, old but sturdy. Oak, iron-braced corners. A padlock dangled open, snapped crudely as if someone had rushed. Edward knelt and lifted the lid. Inside lay objects that made his breath lodge in his throat. A heavy metal stamp engraved with the Millfield Bank emblem. Beside it, pages of practice signatures. The same looping RG repeated dozens of times. stacks of bank forms with faint pencil traces, ready for forging. A small black ledger titled Processing Fees filled with columns of amounts, all matching the pattern of predatory micro fees that could turn someone's debt into a spiral, a trap. Bruno whined again, this time low and uneasy. Edward reached for the ledger. Many entries were initials, but some included full names. Some were crossed out. Some were circled. One name chilled him, Samuel Gardner, Ruth's late husband. Another note beside it, client deceased, continue collections through spouse. Edward's jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle near his temple twitched. He closed the chest with a deliberate thud. Someone had used Ruth's tragedy as paperwork fuel. Someone had taken advantage of her limited literacy and grief. Someone had stolen signatures and dignity, and now that someone wanted her detained before she could speak. He heard footsteps below, not Bruno's, not his, slow, heavy, deliberate. Edward held his breath. Bruno stood frozen at his side, muscles rigid, eyes locked toward the ladder. A growl hummed in his chest, deep and promising violence. A man emerged from the shadows below, revealed by a shaft of moonlight slicing through the barn's open door. He was unfamiliar, a stranger in Haven Bay. Tall, at least 6'2", with broad shoulders and a face carved from rough angles. His jaw carried a dark, stubbly beard, and his eyes were narrow and cold, like smoldering coals that had forgotten what warmth meant. He wore a padded black jacket and work boots. His hands were calloused, hands used to physical labor, or worse, physical enforcement. He carried himself with the dangerous calm of someone who had been in more than one brawl and walked away. "Evenin'," the man said, voice low, with a hint of gravel. "Barn's closed. Private property." Edward straightened, meeting the stranger's gaze. "It's my property." The man's smile was thin and humorless. "Not for long, if you keep opening things you shouldn't." Bruno growled louder. The man shifted his stance, weight balanced, ready. His right hand slipped into his jacket as though checking something inside. Edward moved subtly to place himself between the chest and the stranger. "Who are you?" "Just someone paid to watch the place," the man replied. "Folks been snooping. My employer doesn't like snoopers." "Your employer?" Edward pressed. "Bankers don't like curious people," the man said, "especially ones digging into signatures." The air thickened. Edward recognized the type. Not a local, a contractor, a fixer hired to intimidate, someone who thrived in the cracks where legality grew thin. Bruno bared his teeth, a flash of white. The man chuckled again, unfazed but watchful. "Tell you what, you put that lid back down and forget you saw any of it, and maybe tomorrow doesn't go as bad as it could." Edward took a slow breath. His mind raced. There was no easy way out. The ledger, the stamp, the forgery samples. If the man took them, everything would vanish. Ruth's chance at justice would evaporate. He needed an exit. He needed a distraction. He needed Bruno, and Bruno seemed to know it. The dog lunged, not at the man but at a nearby metal bucket, knocking it down the ladder with a clattering chaos of sound. The stranger cursed, stumbling back instinctively. Edward grabbed the chest's contents, the ledger, the practice pages, the stamp, and stuffed them into his coat. "Go," he hissed. Bruno leapt down the ladder. Edward followed, boots hitting the ground hard. The stranger lunged, reaching to grab Edward's arm, but Bruno intercepted, knocking the man sideways with full force of muscle and momentum. Edward and Bruno burst from the barn into the cold evening. Edward sprinted toward the retreat's boardwalk, heart hammering, chest burning. Behind him, he heard the stranger shouting, stumbling, recovering. Bruno stayed close, pushing forward, urging Edward faster. They reached the gravel road just as headlights appeared. Two beams cutting through fog. A car approaching, not the sheriff's, not Clara's. Something else. The vehicle slowed, the window lowered. A woman sat inside, older, in her early 70s, hair white as foam, glasses perched low on her nose. She had sharp eyes like a librarian who could smell lies the way others smelled smoke. Her voice cracked through the night, like a call to sanctuary. "Edward Barnes, get in the car if you value your life." Edward froze. He recognized her from Clara's description. Eleanor Tice, the retired librarian who hoarded old bank directories and local records. Bruno barked urgently, nudging Edward toward the door. Behind them, footsteps thundered from the barn. Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Now, boy, you've stirred hornets you don't understand. They're coming back with more than threats." Edward threw open the door. Bruno leapt in first. Edward followed, slamming it shut. The car screeched away just as the stranger emerged from the dark, his eyes burning with the kind of fury that promised he would not be the last danger Haven Bay had to fear. The rain came harder than any forecast had dared to mutter, hammering the black tree line as if the sky itself were trying to shake loose its grief. Wind clawed at the abandoned resort's half-fixed shutters, and the cold crept in through every seam. Edward Hale, tall, angular, 58, his salt and pepper beard glistening with storm mist, paced the narrow corridor with a tremor of dread in his chest. He'd known fear before, back when a fraudulent investment partner had nearly destroyed his career. But this shaking of a small girl's lungs awakened a deeper and older terror he had never learned to quiet. Sophie lay on the cot beside Ruth's makeshift bed. The child's dark curls were plastered to her pale forehead, her small frame shuddering with each uneven breath. Her cough, sharp, wet, desperate, tore through the dim room, slicing into Edward's thoughts with cold precision. Ruth hovered beside her daughter, fingers trembling as she dabbed Sophie's cheek with a frayed cloth. In the dull lantern glow, Ruth's face looked thinner than before, 40-something, wiry, brown eyes clouded by sleeplessness, her chestnut hair tied back so hastily it had knotted. She had spent years carrying a grief no one had believed, the sudden death of a husband, the mysterious loan, the shame of illiteracy. Tonight, her fear eclipsed them all. "She's burning up," Ruth whispered. "It's getting worse." Edward felt Bruno tense beside him. The 6-year-old German Shepherd, broad-chested, black and tan fur slicked by the damp amber eyes, always watchful, pressed his weight against Edward's leg. A low, anxious rumble throbbed in the dog's throat. Bruno had alerted them before. Storms, strangers, hidden footprints in the mud outside the resort. But this sound carried urgency. Edward crouched and brushed his fingers through the dog's wet fur. "Easy, boy. We'll fix this." He said it softly, but the words didn't feel strong enough to hold up the night. They needed a doctor. And the only one within reach lived beyond the forest. Dr. Alan Ruiz, a man Edward had met once when inspecting a property 2 years back. Dr. Ruiz was in his late 60s and carried a kind of quiet gravity, a tall, stoop-shouldered man with weathered umber skin, short silver hair, and gentle but penetrating dark eyes. He'd spoken with a soft southwestern lilt, always steady, always patient. But his home was miles away. The highway was already closed by flooding. The storm would only worsen. Ruth clutched Sophie to her chest. "We can't wait until morning." Edward nodded once sharply. "I'll carry her," he said. "Bruno will lead." Ruth hesitated only a heartbeat before wrapping Sophie in the thickest blanket they had, the faded blue quilt Edward had found earlier that week in one of the storage rooms. He scooped Sophie carefully into his arms. Her breath rattled against his collarbone. The sound lodged deep in his ribs like a splinter. "Edward, the trail," Ruth's voice quivered. "It's too dark, and that bridge—" "We won't take the bridge," Edward said. "Bruno knows the old hunter roads. He won't let us fall." The dog straightened as if he understood every word, ears alert, muscles coiled. Thunder boomed overhead, nearly shaking dust from the rafters. Then they stepped out into the storm. The first mile was agony. The wind slapped against Edward like sheets of cold iron, slicing into his coat and chilling the sweat along his neck. Sophie whimpered, her forehead hot against his jaw. Ruth trudged close behind, her thin frame shivering violently. At her side, lantern light flickered, barely carving enough brightness to anchor their steps. The forest swallowed most of the glow. Bruno ran ahead, nose low, tail stiff, weaving through brush with intent. Occasionally he paused, barking sharply to steer them away from a flood-swollen ravine or a patch of mud that would have sucked them into the knee. Edward's breathing grew harsher. His back throbbed beneath Sophie's weight, not because she was heavy, but because fear made every muscle work twice as hard. His boots sank into the soaked ground, and each step felt like a wager with the night. "Sophie," he murmured against her hair, more to keep himself steady than anything. "Stay with me. Keep breathing, sweetheart." The child stirred faintly, a soft, broken cough escaping her lips. Ruth whimpered. "Please don't let her." "She won't," Edward said, though his voice cracked. Bruno suddenly froze. His head jerked to the left, ears pricked. A guttural snarl rumbled from deep in his chest. That was not fear, it was warning. Edward's pulse spiked. The forest went still for a fraction of a breath. Then came the yip, high, sharp, multiplied. Coyotes, desperate from storms, driven close to human scent. Edward shifted Sophie in his arms and widened his stance. Ruth, stay behind me. Bruno stepped forward, fur bristling, teeth bared. He let out a deep, thunderous bark that echoed across the wet trees. A challenge. Another howl rose, this one more distant, then the pattering of retreating paws. Bruno snorted, shook himself, and retreated to Edward's side, his gait taut with vigilance. "Good boy," Edward whispered, though his own heartbeat was a hammer. They moved on. The night pressed tighter. The air grew chillier, heavy with mist. The old wooden bridge, what remained of it, loomed faintly as a dark skeletal outline through the fog. Ruth sucked in a sharp breath. "We can't!" But Bruno didn't lead toward it. Instead, he veered right, deeper into the trees, toward a piece of ground almost invisible beneath overgrowth. Edward recognized it then, the old footpath used by hunters decades ago, a path that bypassed the ravine entirely, a path only someone with a sharper nose could find in a night like this. "Smart boy," Edward whispered again, grateful beyond words. They pushed forward, mud sucking at their soles. The storm thrashed harder, lightning flashing through the branches like splintered bones of the sky. Ruth stumbled once, catching herself on a wet trunk. "I'm fine," she gasped, but she wasn't. None of them were. Still, Sophie needed them to pretend. So they did. At last, faint yellow light flickered ahead through the trees. A house, wooden siding, a porch lamp fighting against the storm. Bruno barked, short, triumphant. Dr. Ruiz. Edward staggered forward, muscles burning, every nerve screaming. He mounted the steps and pounded on the door. It flew open. "Dios mío," Dr. Ruiz breathed, already pulling the child into his arms with the practiced gentleness of someone who has held too many fragile lives. Up close, he was exactly as Edward remembered. Tall but slightly hunched, face carved by years of rural house calls, dark eyes steady and warm despite the alarm. "Get inside. Hurry." The next minutes blurred, lanterns lit, blankets wrapped. Stethoscope pressed against trembling ribs. Dr. Ruiz listened long, his brow furrowing deeper with each breath Sophie struggled to take. "A pneumonia," he finally said, voice grave but not hopeless. "We caught it, just in time. She needs warmth, rest, the antibiotics I'll give you. And no stress, not even a whisper of cold air." Ruth collapsed into the nearest chair, sobbing from exhaustion. Edward's shoulders sagged, as if he'd been holding up the roof all night, and could finally step aside. Dr. Ruiz laid a hand on Edward's arm. "You did well. Very well." Edward swallowed hard. "Will she?" "She'll recover," Ruiz said, "because she wasn't alone." The doctor prepared medicine and spoke softly to the child. Bruno lay beside the bed, head on his paws, but his eyes never closed. His purpose wasn't finished. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the small cabin flickered with a fragile but unmistakable warmth. And then, just when Edward began to breathe again, the door rattled violently. Not from the wind, from a fist. A heavy, deliberate fist. Ruth froze. Edward's spine went rigid. Bruno lifted his head and growled, low and lethal. "Who?" Ruth whispered, voice hollow. Edward stepped toward the doorway. The fist pounded again, louder, insistent. And a voice, cold, familiar, barked through the storm. "Open up, now!" Sheriff Crowder, a day early, and very, very angry. Edward felt the night shift around him, as if the storm suddenly had a second center, one wearing a bateau. Morning crept in as a dull, watery gray, the storm still lingering like a wounded animal refusing to retreat. Dr. Ruiz's cabin smelled of cedar smoke and antiseptic, a fragile sanctuary holding together the night's last threads of courage. Sophie slept more soundly now, her breathing steadier, the fever ebbing with careful medicine and warmth. Bruno dozed lightly near the hearth, his black and tan fur gleaming where it had dried, though his amber eyes flicked open at the slightest shift of wind outside. Edward Hale stood by the front window, jaw clenched, shoulders taut beneath his damp coat. Though tall and broad at first glance, he carried himself with a weariness etched into his posture, sleeplessness, worry, and the ever-present weight of the truth he was fighting to exhume. His salt and pepper beard bristled when he tightened his jaw again. He had survived crooked partners before, learned to read the subtle currents of men hiding rot beneath polished shoes. Sheriff Harvey Crowder fit that too well, Too loud, too certain, too quick to lean on procedure when he wanted results that had nothing to do with law. The heavy slam of a car door punched through the storm's hush. Then another, and another. Bruno growled, rising to his feet. Ruth startled awake in her chair, trembling until she saw Sophie still sleeping peacefully. Edward whispered, "Stay inside. Don't open the door unless I say so." He stepped out onto the porch. Rain misted around him like smoke. Sheriff Crowder was striding across the muddy yard, his tan jacket soaked through, face set in a rigid scowl. Beside him walked Pike Dalton, a broad, block-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a shaved head and a jagged scar snaking down his cheek. He was the kind of man whose eyes never smiled, even when his mouth tried. Dalton had been a mill worker until an injury and a temper problem cost him his job. Crowder had picked him up soon after as a volunteer deputy, though everyone in Haven suspected Dalton had been hired for intimidation, not civic duty. Bringing up the rear was a third figure, a clean-cut man in his late 30s wearing an immaculate charcoal suit. His hair was carefully oiled, his posture stiff, his lips pressed into a thin, impatient line. His name tag, clipped to his leather folder, read, "Elliott Brand, Counsel, Millfield Bank." Crowder jabbed a finger toward Edward. "We're finishing this now. The woman owes the bank, and the law says she comes with me. You obstruct again, you answer for it." Edward didn't flinch. "She's not stepping outside until Sophie is stable. A doctor confirmed she's too sick to move." Brand sniffed, clearly uncomfortable with the mud flicking onto his polished shoes. "The bank's claim predates any medical inconvenience," he said sharply. "The loan is signed, the debt is owed." Bruno barked once, a sharp, cutting sound. Dalton instinctively stepped back. "Get that mutt. He's trained," Edward said, voice low, steady, "and smarter than most men I've met." Before Dalton could retort, an engine approached from the opposite end of the road, a dark navy sedan rolling to a slow, deliberate stop. A woman stepped out, slender and tall, in a fitted gray coat and black boots streaked with rain. Her hair, jet black with silver threads at the temples, was tied neatly into a low knot. She walked with calm purpose, her face composed, sharp eyes scanning each person as if sorting truth from lies with a glance. "Agent Dana Clark," she announced, flashing a badge. "State Bureau of Financial Integrity." Crowder stiffened. "What the hell is this?" "A response," Dana said, "to an anonymous packet of documents forwarded to my office late last night. Documents involving Millfield Bank, several falsified loan authorizations, and a pattern of misconduct correlating with your jurisdiction." Elliott Brand turned pale. Dalton's jaw twitched. Crowder's eyes darted away. Edward didn't move. Dana's gaze locked on him for a moment, assessing, curious, before flicking to the cabin door. "We'll relocate this conversation. Not here. There's a child recovering inside." Edward nodded. She turned to Crowder. "We will conduct a preliminary review immediately." Crowder sputtered. "You can't just interrogate." "We can," Dana said calmly, "and we will. Or would you prefer I call in federal supervision? They love storms and small-town drama." Crowder clenched his fists, but he stepped aside. Dana motioned toward her car. "There's a community space in Haven that's neutral. The church. We'll go there." Edward stayed with Sophie and Ruth while the others drove ahead to the church, but the reprieve lasted only minutes. A soft tapping sounded at the back door, a different rhythm from the sheriff's heavy pounding. Bruno stood immediately, nose lifted. Edward opened the door just a crack. Daniel Cho slipped inside, soaked to the bone. Daniel was in his early 50s, lanky, with a narrow face framed by thinning black hair and rectangular glasses perpetually sliding down his nose. Ink stains marked his fingertips, remnants of years sorting loan documents at Millfield. His shoulders drooped with guilt more than rain. I had to come," Daniel whispered. "I think they know I spoke up." Bruno sniffed him, then wagged his tail once, recognizing the faint chemical scent of Daniel's office ink, the same scent he had tracked the night Edward found the forged signature box in the attic. "They tried to corner me down by the logging pier," Daniel continued, voice shaking. "Pike Dalton and another man I didn't recognize. Bruno, he found me first." Bruno nudged Daniel's leg, as if reassuring him. Edward blinked. "He led you here?" "He pulled me away before Dalton could trap me." Daniel reached into his coat and handed Edward a sealed envelope. "This is everything. A list of borrowers whose signatures were forged, payment ledgers, email printouts, including copies from Weston himself. The name Weston sent a cold blade down Edward's spine. Weston, the district loan manager, charming voice, reptilian morals, the architect of Ruth's misery. "They'll bury me for this," Daniel whispered. Unless we go public," Edward finished. Exactly what Clara planned. The Church of St. Mildred sat on a hill overlooking Haven. Whitewashed wood, tall stained windows glowing faintly from inside. A handful of locals were already gathered. Word traveled fast, even in storms. Among them stood Father Burrows, a short, round man in his late 70s, with tufts of white hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. His nature was gentle, his presence calming, though tonight tension pinched even his usually jovial cheeks. Clara Monroe was there too, hair pinned back, emerald scarf wrapped around her neck, her eyes darting between Edward and the officials. She gave him a small, worried smile. It steadied something in him he hadn't realized was shaking. Inside, pews had been rearranged to form a rough semicircle. Dana Clark led the session with clinical precision, her voice steady despite the rain hammering the stained glass windows. Daniel Cho presented the documents, his hands trembling, his voice cracking each time he had to read a forged name aloud. Elliot Brand protested at every turn, but the evidence strangled his arguments. When the list of ghost signatures was displayed, a hush fell. Ruth's name stared back at them, stamped, signed, falsified, others too, dozens. Crowder shifted in his seat, his normally booming voice dimmed to a hoarse whisper. I didn't know the full extent," he muttered. "Weston told me the debts were clean. He said he'd help my nephew with college, and—" his voice broke. "He promised I'd move up to county chief." Dana's gaze softened only slightly. "Sheriff, accepting incentives in exchange for selective enforcement is a violation of state code." "I know," Crowder whispered. Rain rattled the roof harder, as if the sky itself demanded the truth stripped bare. And then, as Edward watched, Sheriff Crowder buried his face in his hands, not in anger, but in something close to shame, something human. Dana lifted the evidence envelope Daniel had delivered. "This is enough to initiate a formal inquiry. No one leaves town until I say so." The room stirred with shock and murmurs. Bruno, lying at Edward's feet, lifted his head and growled softly, not at anyone in the room, but toward the church door, as if sensing something none of them yet saw. Storm wind howled outside, a shadow flickered past the window, and something, or someone, moved in the rain. Night fell with the uneasy heaviness of a lid closing over a pot ready to boil. Haven Bay lay shrouded beneath low clouds that clung to the dark water like bruises, the moon obscured, the air thick with the metallic scent of a storm that refused to leave. Edward Hale stood outside St. Mildred's church, scanning the rain-wet hill with a tightening jaw. Since the confrontation earlier, Haven had shifted, people whispering in doorways, lights burning late in windows, uncertainty pressing in like the tide. But what unsettled Edward most wasn't the storm, nor the pending investigation. It was the shadow Bruno had sensed through the stained glass window, too quiet, too steady, like someone measuring them. Now, the night itself seemed to be holding its breath. Edward's coat hung heavy on his broad shoulders, droplets sliding from his sleeves as he listened. Bruno stood beside him, tall, muscular, 6-year-old German Shepherd, fur dark as the bay's depths, amber eyes shimmering with sharp vigilance. The slight tear in the dog's right ear caught the lamplight, a reminder of earlier dangers, a badge of survival. Inside the church, Ruth and Sophie slept on borrowed cots, under the watchful eyes of Father Burrows and Dr. Ruiz, who had insisted on staying nearby. Clara Monroe was also there, elegant in her emerald scarf, her chestnut hair pinned back in a loose bun. Despite exhaustion, she moved with the warm dignity of someone whose kindness had been forged through difficulty, not softness. Her laugh earlier in the cafe, when she joked about ghosts ordering decaf lattes, still lingered at the edges of Edward's memory like a fragile piece of sunlight. She stepped out now, wrapping her coat tighter. "You're listening again," she murmured, approaching him. "Same way you did when we found Ruth in that collapsing store." Her voice held a shimmer of humor, but her eyes were serious. "Bruno's uneasy," Edward said. "That usually means trouble." As if cued by his words, Bruno's ears snapped forward, his nose lifted. A sharp, distinct scent cut through the damp air, acrid, oily, gasoline. Edward stiffened. "Bruno, where?" The shepherd bolted toward the bay, paws kicking up mud. Clara gasped. "Edward!" "Stay with the others," Edward said, already sprinting after the dog. But Clara followed anyway, her stride quick despite the mud. Determination shaped her expression, that mixture of grace and stubborn steel that had surprised Edward since the day he met her. They reached the ridge overlooking Haven Bay just as Bruno growled, deep and thunderous. Below, near the old storage warehouse, the very place where evidence was kept, dark shapes moved. A boat rocked quietly against the pier. 3 men stepped off, dressed in slick black raincoats. One carried a metal canister in each hand. The largest of them, with shoulders like a battering ram and a balding head under a hood, stood guard. Even from afar, Edward recognized him by his hulking silhouette, Pike Dalton. Another figure emerged, narrower, leaner. He wore a gray hood and carried a long metal bar. A third followed with more canisters. And then Edward saw the flames. They weren't lit yet, but the intention in the men's movements was unmistakable. They were splashing gasoline around the wooden base of the warehouse. The place would go up in seconds if they struck a match. Edward's heart hammered. "No, no, no! If the evidence goes up, Ruth's case dies with it." Clara's voice trembled. "They came by the bay to avoid Agent Clark." Before Edward could answer, Bruno surged forward with a fierce bark, but Edward caught his collar just in time. "Not yet, boy. Wait." Then through the darkness, a small rope glinted, hanging from a weather-beaten post near the church's bell. The storm had quieted just enough that Edward suddenly remembered what Father Burrows had told the congregation earlier. "This bell hasn't rung since '78, but if it ever does again, folks will know it's trouble." Edward's breath caught. Bruno tugged the collar once, hard, as if urging him. Edward ran. Up the small slope, mud sliding under his boots, rain stinging his eyes, Clara shouting behind him. He grabbed the rope and yanked with the full strength of a man who had carried a child through a storm the night before. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, gong. A deep, ancient sound thundered across Haven Bay, rolling through the night, echoing off every rooftop and every wave. Bruno barked in fierce triumph. Lights flickered on across the town. Doors slammed open. Figures stumbled outside in pajamas and raincoats. The bell rang again. Edward kept pulling, muscles burning. Clara gasped beside him, breathless. "You woke the whole town!" "That's the point," Edward panted. Below, Dalton and the others froze mid-stride. Gasoline splashed onto the mud. One of the men dropped his canister, startled. Bruno bounded down the hill, Edward and Clara racing after him. They reached the warehouse's edge just as the townsfolk arrived, dozens of them, carrying pails, blankets, old fire extinguishers, anything they had. Father Burrows led them, waving his arms like a general. Dr. Ruiz followed behind, hollering instructions. Even the eldest residents moved with surprising resolve. The intruders panicked. One man lit a match, but Bruno sprang forward, knocking him flat, teeth bared, ripping the match from his grip. Sparks flew harmlessly into the mud. Dalton roared and pulled a gun, aiming at Edward. Time slowed. Bruno's bark cracked the air. Dalton's finger tightened on the trigger, but someone else moved first. Agent Dana Clark emerged from the shadows behind the warehouse, soaked trenchcoat clinging to her tall, slender frame, her sharp black hair plastered to her cheekbones. Her pistol gleamed under the lantern light. "Drop the weapon!" she shouted. Dalton snarled, swinging the gun. Toward her, a flash of fur streaked across the mud. Bruno lunged, jaws clamping onto Dalton's wrist. The gun flew from his hand, skittering across the ground. Dalton screamed. Clark tackled him hard, pinning him with quick, brutal efficiency. Edward rushed in, grabbing Bruno before the dog could be kicked. "Easy, boy. You did it." Dalton writhed, cursing, but Clark slammed cuffs onto his wrists. The other intruders froze when half the town surrounded them, carrying buckets of seawater in righteous fury. Crowder appeared at last, jacket half-buttoned, hair wild, face grim. He looked at Dalton in the mud, then at the flaming evidence canisters, then at the terrified men. Something inside him broke. Something else, something older, rose in its place. Crowder unpinned his sheriff's badge with trembling fingers. Then he threw it into the mud beside Dalton. "I'm done being someone's pawn," Crowder said. His voice cracked but held power. "Tonight, I stand with this town, and with that child who almost died. Pick up your gun, Dalton, and I'll arrest you myself." Dalton glared up at him with baffled rage, but he didn't reach for the gun. From her phone, Agent Clark's voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone, listen. She read the message on her screen. State Board has issued an emergency suspension of Millfield Bank's operations. Weston is being taken into custody by federal agents at dawn. A gasp rippled through the townsfolk. Ruth sagged against Clara, crying softly. Edward exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for months, maybe years. Bruno pressed against his leg, tail thumping once, as if saying, "It's not over, but we're winning." Yet even amid relief, Edward's gaze drifted to the bay. The boat the intruders arrived on rocked at the pier, and standing upon it, unseen by the others, was a lone figure, tall, hooded, watching. Then, as if melting into the fog, the figure slipped into the night, and the rain swallowed him whole. Dawn broke with the gentlest breath Haven Bay had felt in weeks, a pale gold glow slipping through the thinning mist and pooling across the wet grass in soft halos. The storm was gone, carried into legend by the murmurs of the townsfolk, leaving behind a world washed clean, as though the bay, the hills, even the old wooden boardwalk had been baptized anew. Edward Hale stood near the shoreline, hands in the pockets of his weathered coat. The man who had once carried the weight of every failed deal, every betrayal, every lonely winter, now carried something else, something that rose inside him the way light rose over the bay. Hope. He watched Sophie race across the damp meadow, her small boots splashing through silver puddles. The girl's dark curls bounced wildly in the breeze. Her cheeks glowed with new health, and her laughter spilled into the morning air like a song returning to a place long silent. Bruno bounded beside her, 6-year-old German Shepherd, coat gleaming in the sunlight, tail sweeping in wide, joyful arcs. The slight tear in his ear only made him look more heroic, a badge of honor from a dog who had spent days outsmarting, outrunning, and outprotecting grown men. Sophie threw a stick across the field, and Bruno darted after it, his paws kicking up arcs of dew. Ruth watched from the porch of Haven Home, formerly the abandoned resort, now freshly painted, its windows repaired, its crooked sign replaced with one carved by local volunteers. She looked healthier too. No longer tense and hollow-eyed, she held her head high, her brown hair neatly brushed back, her posture steadier. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans, nothing fancy, but clean, warm, and hers. Her job as manager of the town's newly revived general store gave her dignity again. Her salary ensured she and Sophie would never be at the mercy of loans or men like Weston. When she spotted Edward, Ruth gave a shy, grateful nod, the kind people reserve for those who pulled them from the edge of a cliff. Edward returned it with a soft smile. He didn't need words for this moment. Haven Bay itself seemed to speak. At the town hall later that morning, Agent Dana Clark addressed the crowd. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, her jet black hair pulled back into a commanding bun, she stood with her usual calm authority. The storm had left her coat splattered with mud last night. Today, not a speck remained. Dana Clark carried herself like a woman who fixed things and expected the world to keep up. By order of the state, she announced, all debts associated with Millfield Bank's falsified authorizations are officially void. The victims hold no obligations, financial or legal. A wave of relieved gasps filled the room. Ruth clutched Sophie closer. Daniel Cho sat in the front pew beside Dr. Ruiz, trying not to draw attention, though he could not hide his ink-stained fingers ringing nervously in his lap. A man in his early 50s, soft-spoken, thin, with a narrow, scholarly face. It was clear he had never imagined his life would twist into a battle of evidence and shadows. But today, Daniel's posture had changed. While still timid, there was a new steadiness in his gaze. He had chosen truth over fear, and it had saved more than one life. Dana continued, Daniel Cho has agreed to enter witness protection under provisional terms. His cooperation was critical. Without him, this town might still be under siege by fraudsters. Daniel swallowed hard, but when he glanced at Edward, his eyes brimmed with gratitude. Bruno, lying at Edward's feet, wagged gently as if in approval. By noon, a modest ceremony gathered outside Haven Home. Edward stood behind a simple wooden podium that Mason Rivers, a retired carpenter in his late 60s, tall and lanky, with snow-white brows and a permanent scent of cedar, had crafted overnight. Mason, though not central to the previous events, was known in Haven as a man of gentle humor and long patience, traits forged through years, caring for a wife lost too soon. He handed the podium to Edward with a wink. She's sturdy, holds truth better than most politicians. Edward chuckled softly. the sound unfamiliar, almost strange coming from a man who once had little reason to laugh. The townsfolk formed a semicircle. Clara Monroe stood near the front, tall, elegant, wrapped in her olive gray coat, her glossy brown hair pinned with a silver clasp that caught the sunlight. Her eyes, warm, keen, with a spark of wit, had a way of reading Edward more clearly than he read himself. He inhaled slowly before speaking. I bought this land thinking I'd turn it around for profit, he said, but I learned something about home these past few weeks. Home isn't a property. Home is a promise. The crowd murmured softly. So, today, he continued, I'm establishing Haven Home Trust, dedicating this land as an affordable, community-run elder home, a place where no one will fear the winter, or storms, or men with forged papers ever again. The applause rose like a tide. Ruth covered her mouth, tears sparkling. Clara's expression softened into something luminous. Crowder appeared next, without a badge. The former sheriff wore plain work jeans and a simple brown jacket, his rugged face stripped of swagger. His short gray hair was unkempt, and the lines at the corners of his eyes looked deeper, carved by regret. I owe a debt, he said, stepping forward. A real one, not the kind stamped on forged documents. He looked at Ruth, then at Sophie playing with Bruno nearby. I failed as a protector, so I've asked to serve community hours here, cleaning, repairs, whatever's needed, and I'll stand before the court tomorrow to answer for the rest. The crowd murmured again, some surprised, some moved. Edward nodded once, respectful. Crowder may have stumbled, but he had chosen to stand up differently. That evening, as dusk painted Haven Bay in lavender and rose gold, the town gathered for the Lantern Lighting Festival, revived after 20 silent years. Old wooden lanterns, newly fitted with warm LED bulbs, lined the boardwalk. Dozens more floated on the water, glowing like tiny stars drifting along the tide. Children laughed. Older couples held hands. The scent of cinnamon cider drifted through the air. Edward stood by the railing, lantern in hand, watching the bay mirror the lights like a shimmering path to something sacred. Beside him, Clara approached softly. She wore a simple cream scarf, her cheeks touched by the cold, her smile gentle but a little mischievous. You've changed this town, she said. You've changed more than you know. Edward shook his head. I just tried to do the right thing. You did, Clara said. And you didn't do it alone. She slipped her hand into his, slowly, carefully, as if giving him space to pull away. He didn't. Her hand felt warm, steady, exactly like the thing he had been searching for without knowing. She looked up at him. Edward, you've spent your life finding homes for other people. Maybe it's time you choose one for yourself. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced down at Bruno, who now wore a bright blue bandana embroidered with tiny lantern symbols. The dog sat proudly, tail sweeping small arcs on the boardwalk. What do you think, boy? Edward murmured. Bruno huffed, a soft, approving sound. Edward turned to Clara. His voice was quiet but sure. If home is a promise, then I choose here, and I choose you. Clara's smile bloomed like sunrise. They leaned closer, not rushed, not dramatic, simply inevitable, while lanterns drifted into the bay like blessings. Above them, the restored bell tower glowed. Father Burroughs had announced earlier that Bruno would be the honorary lighthouse keeper, a symbolic role, complete with weekly treats and unlimited head pats. Bruno accepted the title with the serious dignity of a dog who had saved a town. Laughter echoed, music began, and Haven Bay, once bruised by storms, secrets, and fear, now pulsed with the warmth of a great, sprawling family. And when the last lanterns along Haven Bay flickered against the calm water, it became clear that miracles rarely arrive with thunder or trumpet blasts. More often, they come quietly, through the steady kindness of an ordinary man who opens his door to strangers, or through a loyal dog who listens to what hearts cannot yet speak. Some say it was luck that guided Edward, others say it was courage. But those who know the rhythm of this old bay will tell you the truth. Sometimes God sends his mercy in small footsteps, warm hands, or a soft bark cutting through the dark. In our own lives, his touch is no different. Between the errands, the worries, and the long evenings, there are moments, small, almost hidden, when grace brushes against us. A neighbor checking in, a child's laughter on a cold morning, the faithful companionship of a dog who waits at the door. These are the quiet reminders that we are never fully alone, and that God still walks beside us, guiding, sheltering, and lifting us when the world feels heavy. If this story brought you even a little comfort or stirred something hopeful in your heart, I invite you to share it so its light can travel farther. Leave a comment about a moment when you felt God's hand in your life. Your story may be the lantern someone else needs tonight. And if you wish to follow more tales of grace, courage, and the small miracles hidden in everyday places, feel free to subscribe. May God bless you, keep you, and watch over your home, just as He watched over Haven Bay.